welcome in. It's another edition of the Blue White Breakdown brought to you by Penn State Health. I'm Dustin Hockensmith. Daniel Gallen, man around town, is back with me now this time on this edition of the Blue White Breakdown. You can also check in out earlier this week with Bob Flounders talking Ohio State and everything else. Bob also did his usual weekly podcast with Dave Jones. So we got a lot of good stuff on this Penn State football program coming to you now. Ohio State week, Daniel, big week coming up. Back-to-back losses. Obviously, we're not telling anybody anything that they don't know already. Really another type of dramatic week. Last week, the quarterback drama was front and center. And this week, we've got just the James Franklin distraction overload storyline coming. And I want to start with that. Just the idea of distractions and what James Franklin can and can't do to minimize all this discussion going on out there with LSU and USC and what he has said to the public, what he hasn't said to the public. We saw him earlier this week calling Ohio State, Illinois, and calling the Horseshoe the Big House. What is your take on all of this, just in terms of, Franklin said last night there just were some things that he can't really say. And I guess my question is why, but what do you think as you sit here and watch James Franklin kind of squirm a bit in this situation?
Yeah, it was definitely an uncharacteristic performance from James Franklin on Tuesday. He's usually very measured, knows exactly what he's going to say, how he's going to say it, and he delivers the message that he wants to deliver. So you hear him misspeak once, and then you're kind of like, oh, that's a little weird. And then it happens again, and it's something that you notice. I mean, personally, I don't necessarily read too much into it. The Illinois game, that's a loss that is going to linger no matter what someone says about, oh, we give this up by we're going to give this up by Tuesday and then move on. I mean, that was a loss, 9 overtimes in that kind of fashion. That's something that's going to bleed into next week, no matter, how much you talk about your mentality. And then, I mean, once you get into the nicknames for the stadiums, I think that they're all large, they're all big houses, one way or another. So I didn't notice that one initially. Someone else pointed that one out to me after the fact. So I guess that shows how much I've been paying attention to stadium names recently.
Well, I have two schools of thought whenever I hear. I mean, just the irony in this in saying that. Oh no, our focus is exclusively on Illinois. I mean, there's just so much there. But I always think with James Franklin, is this some kind of like ninja mind game that he's playing? Like, I mean, because he is so prepared all the time. And I think I lean more towards, media responsibilities are usually something he probably thinks through quite a bit before he makes them. Where this week he's so kind of dialed in and obviously living through last week that he probably just didn't think too much about media responsibilities this week. That's where I ultimately land on. But the thought did flash through my head: is he trying to, I don't know, play the distracted guy to for some reason or other? I don't know, but it doesn't make any sense to me. But James Franklin always seems to think everything through.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the surprise to me, and it was also one of his shorter news conferences, Tuesday news conferences. I think it timed in around 30 minutes. Sometimes they get a little bit closer to 40 or more than 40, depending on what's going on, how many people have questions, how James is answering those questions. So it was a little bit of a different Tuesday. But I think last night Wednesday night after practice, we saw kind of a little bit more of the James Franklin in the media setting that we've kind of come to know this season and over the past 8 years or so.
And how about the moving parts that he referenced last night, Wednesday night? Just saying, essentially that he's boxed in. There are things happening on this or not happening that he just can't really get into the X's. I've been trying to think about what those moving parts are and what's preventing him from saying anything other than the obvious of contract situation leverage. I mean, what other moving parts could there be?
Yeah, I mean, the quote unquote moving parts, that's obviously something that he's not going to air at this point in the season with everything that's going on. But I think just kind of in general, there's a lot of focus on James Franklin himself, that he's the one who's making a decision. He's the one where all this stems from. But I think, just kind of speaking generally, there are a lot of moving parts when it comes to these things, whether it's USC, LSU. It's kind of a thing where it takes two to tango. This isn't, James Franklin doesn't live in a vacuum where he is pulling all the strings. He is the one that is kind of that he is making all the decisions. He is the one that is putting everything into place. I mean, there's two sides to everything, and those things can change week to week based on, in a hypothetical, what a booster at another school suddenly thinks, or if another coach somewhere emerges as the hot candidate down the stretch. And then even at Penn State, he has relationships that he has to manage. Those are constantly changing. I kind of interpreted that as kind of that there are external factors, in that as much as he has control over his future and what happens, there are also other things that he can't control. I'm sure he'd like to control them, that will kind of have input or impact what happens in the future.
It's also possible that there's some kind of contract negotiation going on in house where he can't really change his public position just yet, at risk of losing that. Anyway, one other thing that he continues to say that I wanted to touch on with you also was just the physicality of the offensive line. It does feel like, I can't really say how many times we've heard this, but if you have to plead publicly for your offensive line to be more physical, you have to do that multiple times. Is that not some kind of red flag that, whether it's coaching or whether it's the players, that they haven't responded to this yet, but he still went with that line again this week? And I mean, frankly, it's something all the fans have been looking for too, is a little bit more of that physical mentality.
Yeah, and I think that it's magnified after the Illinois game, where you had 7 of those 9 overtimes. You get the ball at the 3-yard line and you only score once. You only get 3 yards once. Obviously, they tried a couple different avenues to get there, in terms of shovel pass, trick play, one other pass, but you need to get 3 yards. That's kind of what it comes down to. And I think that we talked about it earlier this year, especially with the running game, that there was going to be a game. I don't necessarily think we thought it was going to be an overtime shootout against Illinois, but we said that there are going to be these games where they're going to need to run the ball, need to get this yardage at a key juncture in the game, and that came on Saturday, and it didn't happen. And you look at an offensive line that brought 3 starters back, technically only 2 returning starters in their previous positions, with Mike Miranda moving around. But you kind of thought that they'd built depth there, and that they would be in a position where this would be an area of the team, the offensive line and the running backs, that you didn't have to worry about. And now we're almost 2/3 of the way into the season, and it has not gone like that. So it is kind of a concern that at this point in the season, that you want your team to be more physical. You're urging them to be more physical, because Franklin was asked about this on Wednesday night. How do you do this in the season, especially when you already have health problems at a couple key positions, and you want to keep guys healthier down the stretch? You don't want to wear guys down in practice before games at a point in the season where there's probably already some wear and tear. I mean, this is the thing that you're supposed to do in the spring, in the summer, in right before the season starts. So I think that is, you kind of raise your eyebrows at that, especially when you look at what they're going up against in the Ohio State front 7 this weekend. But I think that it just kind of comes down to the players. They're going to have to step up and show, and we'll see if what James Franklin and Phil Troutline and everyone else have been preaching behind the scenes, we'll see if that resonates.
Well, and the other thing is, we did see, in the second half against Illinois, we saw that shuffling of the offensive line, namely Mike Miranda moving back to right guard and Juice Scruggs moving to center. It could be Eric Wilson. It could be Bryce Hefner. do you expect to see, and I do kind of expect to see that experiment continue from the jump against Ohio State? What's your take just on the shuffling? Because I will also say that midway through last year, they turned the corner in part because they made some adjustments along the offensive line, namely moving Will Fries in from right tackle to right guard.
Yeah, we talked to Mike Miranda, G Scruggs, and Sean Clifford yesterday or on Wednesday, and no one really offered much insight one way or another what that, of course, what that starting offensive line will look like. But I wouldn't be as surprised if we saw G Scruggs at center, Mike Miranda at right guard. I mean, Mike Miranda was an all Big Ten second team performer at left guard last season, and it just hasn't really been there at center, I guess. And G Scruggs is someone that has a really high ceiling. This is his first real extended action. So I think it'll be interesting to see kind of what he can do down the stretch. But I think we'll see some shuffling. Um, I mean, I'm pretty big on offensive line chemistry. I'm a proponent of you keep things as the same as possible. And coming off a couple of years of covering the Philadelphia Eagles and all the offensive line problems they had, the big philosophy there was if someone was hurt or someone was struggling, you made all your switches one for one. You took someone out and you put someone in. You didn't start to move guys around, because when you move guys around, it's not technically one new player on the line. It'll be two new players at two new positions, players at three new positions, and there's kind of a chain reaction that can come from that. So I think that the eighth game of the year, kind of experimenting with different offensive line combinations when it's not injury related is not where you want to be. But that's going to be something to really watch up front, especially when you factor in that the running backs haven't really been making plays on their own. Sean Clifford is hurt, or is at least hampered. There's kind of things could, starting up front, things could get bad if things kind of start to spiral.
Sort of like I don't want to use the word desperate, but just looking for a spark and needing to try to find a spark and create one somehow. And I would say, Mike Miranda being the veteran of this interior line group, it makes all the sense in the world to have him at center, where his leadership and experience and his communication can pay off. But at the same time, Juice Scruggs, I don't think anybody would argue, is a much more twitchy offensive lineman. And when you talk about getting the ball off, getting the snap back, and being able to adjust your focus to blocking the man or the men in front of you, I think that extra little bit of quickness off the ball, it could sort of pay dividends. But I do lean more towards, as you're saying, just doing anything you can to try to find a spark, try to create the right combination, try to create some urgency that just hasn't really been there. So we'll see. It's a tough opponent if they are going to go that route against Ohio State, to try to again go with that experiment. You mentioned Sean Clifford being hampered. Obviously, maybe the storyline in this game. It was the storyline last week. I don't think, and I include myself in this group, I don't think a lot of people are giving this team much of a shot if he's not the player who showed up for the first 5+ games. That's the player that you need if you're going to threaten this Ohio State defense. And I know the Buckeyes have figured things out, but it doesn't look to me still like this is that invincible unit that is unconquerable. I think the issue will be with Penn State's offense is keeping pace with Ohio State's offense, and I don't give them much of a chance if Clifford isn't pretty sharp on Saturday.
Definitely. Clifford said yesterday that he believes he'll be 100% on Saturday. James Franklin said that he expects Clifford to be closer to 100%. James Franklin also said that Clifford felt great on Sunday after that game, which I assume there's some poetic license there around the word great. But I think that Clifford gives them the chance to win. James Franklin was asked again Wednesday night about why we didn't see a backup quarterback at any point, given Clifford being kind of visibly hurting and not really playing up to the level that we've seen him play. And James Franklin said that Clifford in that state still gave them the best chance to win, which kind of is a leads to a bigger conversation that we can have at a later date about the quarterback position. But I mean, Sean Clifford needs to be 100% if Penn State has a shot. The Ohio State offense is really clicking. Penn State is going to have to score points this year, which they haven't really done outside of that Ball State game and I guess Villanova too. So they've scored points on the teams that they were supposed to score points on, but the other teams, it's kind of been those tight defensive minded games. But you look at what Ohio State has done recently, CJ Stroud is really, I think, finding himself. You can adjust for opponent. They haven't really played any of the the bigger, tougher teams since that Oregon game. You look at the teams that they've beaten and the fact that they felt comfortable with their quarterback room because they had Akron on the schedule where they just rested CJ Stroud for a game and there was no drop off with Kyle McCord in there. I think that kind of shows the kind of talent level that is there, and it's gonna cause some problems. I mean, Travion Henderson has been really fun to watch. Just 8.8 yards per carry, 11 touchdowns, and I was looking at his game logs, and he only has 200-yard games this year, and 3 games where he's had more than 10 carries because he just does so much with his limited carries that they don't really need him to do anything else. So they're gonna have to score points, and Clifford gives them the best opportunity to do that, which is something that I think we've said this a couple times this year, where a year ago we would not really have expected this to be the situation.
And I think, I mean, you sort of underscored just the difference between these two offenses is efficiency and Ohio State's ability to be in advantageous positions at all times because they're able to create with a lot of consistency, 5, 6, 7 yard plays on those early downs. So now they're in 2nd and 2s and 2nd and 3s. And it's been the opposite case for Penn State. I think you can view the running game as an antiquated or not an essential part of football, but you've seen how it pays dividends or how it doesn't pay dividends if you can't get that going. And I don't think there's any debate that Penn State's been in a lot of 2nd and 8s and a lot of 3rd and 7s, and they're just not positions where, defenses have to account for everything. And I think Ohio State does such a good job of being in those good positions at all times. And that's, I think, the maybe the most concerning thing for me is that, Illinois was able to use that big formation and not everybody, Ohio State's not going to resort to that, but be able to create 5 or 6 yards almost at will. Like, it's hard for me to watch Illinois run for 357 yards and think that Ohio State's not going to be ahead of the chains pretty much all night. And you can't be in that spot. I know we're talking offense here, but that's exactly what Penn State has been unable to do because you can't reliably get 5 yards at a clip.
Yeah, I kind of mentioned this with Bob on Thursday's podcast, but it's kind of from a Penn State defensive perspective. You go into the game and you're really looking forward to that matchup between the secondary and the wide receivers with Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jackson Smith and Jigba going up against Joey Porter Jr., Jaquan Brisker, Tariq Castro Fields, Zaquan Hardy. I mean, that should be a really fun matchup. But then you look at what Illinois did to Penn State on the ground last week, and it's kind of like, well, how much of that are we actually going to get to see if they can just give the ball to Travion Henderson? I think Master Teague is supposed to be back this week. Obviously, they have the depth there, and that offensive line is good. And with no PJ Mustipher in the middle, it's going to be hard for Penn State to stop that running game. So that might kind of cheat us out of what could be one of the more entertaining matchups of the season.
And I do think Ohio State's going to recognize that they can get yardage at will by doing the same thing that Illinois did, running right at them again and again and again. But my thought with Ohio State is they're not going to be interested in stringing together 18 play drives to score. I think they're going to try to establish and reestablish and go hunting down the field and put those safeties in conflict and try to make Brent Pry have to decide, are we going to support the run? Or are we going to send have these guys drop in the coverage? And it's not going to be an easy thing to decide in game. And I think Ohio State's going to try to have some fun with that.
Yeah, Penn State has been really playing that bend don't break defense this year, which you kind of look at, especially in the context of the Illinois game, where they gave up 357 rushing yards, but only 10 points in regulation. which is that's wild. I mean, but they get those timely plays. They make things happen when they need to. But this is the first time this year where they're really going up against an offense that is actually designed to break you. And I think that's going to be a really interesting dynamic. Penn State has done a good job of kind of limiting the big plays. And they've been kind of content to, you'll see like the Auburn game where Auburn, Tank Bigsby's getting his yards, they're moving up the field, they're moving up. And then when the field condenses in the red zone, that's where Penn State steps up. That's where they get the stops. But the way that the Ohio State offense is built and the way that they're playing, they don't even need to get to the red zone. They thrive when they're back and they have the whole field to work with. And I think that's something that Penn State hasn't really seen this year that will be an interesting kind of subplot, I think.
And I do think the bend but don't break, the getting tough in the red zone is part of the personality of this defense. And you give Penn State a lot of credit for that. Mathematically, to give up 357 on the ground and only give up 10 points seems impossible, but this group was able to pull it off. I would just add to that as a quick rebuttal. I think it's easy to not break when it's Spencer Petras, when it's Bo Nix, when it's Graham Mertz. CJ Stroud, this will be maybe his biggest test yet, in terms of the defense that he's playing. So then maybe there's some part of him that's unproven. Maybe he'll be more mistake prone than we've seen. And maybe Penn State can force that in these tight, condensed situations. They're going to need to do that. They're going to need to pressure him at the right moments and fluster him. And we'll see what happens. I'm not ruling that out, but CJ Stroud is the best quarterback that Penn State has played so far. And I'm not sure it's particularly close. So having that threat, not just with his arm, but obviously with Olave and Wilson and all those guys, it's going to be a new and unique challenge. I love this Penn State defense, and you'd love it a little bit less when they show that vulnerability inside that they showed last week, but we'll see if they can make up for that. We'll get into the prediction real quick. I just wanted to get into the recruiting stuff from last weekend. Jordan Allen, 3-star defensive back from Louisiana, who I believe committed to Penn State without being on campus first. So, there's always a threat of that. You get a guy who's from 1,000 miles away, who's never been on campus when he commits. The relationship can go a number of ways. So he decommits. I think Sean Fitz from Lions 247 reported that was in the works before Saturday's debacle. So you can kind of, chop off that connection right there. At the same time, commitment number 4 rolls in from Joey. I'm going to go with Schlafer on this one. I haven't heard his name pronounced, the Exeter Township tight end. Interesting player who I think Penn State sees a lot of future upside. He's 6'6", 205 right now, or 210, depending on where you look. Boy, just like Tyler Warren got to 260 real quick, you can kind of imagine this guy at 6'6", 250, like 6 months from now, a year from now, and really see him explode and maybe be that 4-star guy. What'd you think about the 1-for-1 swap? You're down 1 in 22, you're up 1 in 23.
Yeah, Jordan Allen was part of that big run in July, and he committed without taking a visit. But he took his official visit for the whiteout. And like you said, it appeared that this was something that was in the works before Saturday, based on the reporting from Rivals and 247 Sports, and that it appeared to revolve around a visit that Allen took to Ole Miss. I saw on his Instagram, it looked like he had a good time at his photo shoot. But yeah, that class still has 25 commits in it. They're number 3 nationally. Depending on what happens with Mekhi Flowers and Christian Driver and what position those guys play at the next level, you might not necessarily really be losing a defensive back in Allen. You might pick one up kind of in a position switch later. So I think that the class is still fine. He was from Louisiana. He wasn't one of the big local heavy hitters. Obviously, you want to extend your footprint as much as you can. And Penn State has I think they've talked about how they've taken advantage of the ability to use Zoom and do things virtually, and that's helped a lot. So we'll see. That's probably a scholarship that they can use on another player down the stretch or even a transfer. So I think that's something, and especially since it wasn't connected to what happened Saturday, I don't necessarily think it's something to sound the alarm over. And then adding the tight end, Joey Schlafer. I forget how many weeks ago we did that tight end episode And we kind of talked about the template that Penn State has been following, and kind of like you said, this seems to kind of follow that. Good frame you can add weight to. There are tools there that you can kind of extrapolate to the next level, and also doesn't hurt to be in kind of early on a local kid. The past, after a pretty rough 2021 cycle locally, Penn State rebounded in 2022, and now they're off to a good start in 2023 with Schlafer as the number 11 player in Pennsylvania in the composite rankings. So it's recruiting. It never stops. And we've kind of talked about how when you have 26 commits in the fold so early, there's going to be some settling. There's going to be some movement. It's just kind of it's like, it's nobody's fault really. It's just kind of the nature of the business at this point.
Well, especially as you said, when that run begins and you can feel like your spot is in jeopardy if you don't commit, then that seems like, as we look back on it, Jordan Allen grabbing that spot, but never really fully kind of shutting things down. And you can't blame a kid for that. I mentioned Ohio State predictions. We put those out on Thursday on PennLive. Those are available now. I picked 42-17. I just have a hard time believing that Ohio State's not going to be able to use that running game to their advantage, both in the run and with the pass. And, I think Penn State's offense, I wouldn't rule out some kind of miraculous recovery, but I don't think I would bet on a miraculous recovery coming from that Illinois game. That was an ugly showing against that Illini team. Didn't establish the run. I'm still not buying the being able to establish the run on the fly against this defense in this situation and that setting. But crazier things have happened, I suppose.
Yeah, I went with Ohio State 31, Penn State 14. I think when I made the pick, the spread was around 18 and a half. And it's just I made a joke with Bob earlier this week when the spread jumped, where I said, "Oh, it feels like Ohio State minus anything." But the more I kind of thought about it, it's a big number. Penn State kind of rises to the occasion. Even last year, where they lost by double digits, it was still only 13 points, and it was kind of one of those games where it felt like the margin was a lot bigger than it actually was.
Yeah.
So I can see Penn State coming out, rising to the occasion, coming out and keeping it tight early. I think that's kind of their best hope, especially when you look at how Clifford, his trajectory went during the game against Illinois, where as the game went on, he became less effective. So I think that you kind of have to come out, ride that adrenaline, ride that momentum early, jump out, and kind of make it a game early. But then I see kind of Ohio State's athletes, their talent, that running game. I can see that kind of taking over as the game goes on, and maybe pulling away in the third and fourth quarter. So I think it'll be close early, and then Ohio State kind of asserts itself, and the the gap between the elite programs and the good/great/ tier 2 or 3, however you want to divide it up. I think that gap will become evident as the night goes on in Columbus.
I think covering would feel a bit like a victory at this point. But you're right. I mean, this is a team under James Franklin that's played Ohio State really tough. They're not really afraid of that situation. They do rise to the occasion. They play up to the level of the opponent. I think you hit the nail on the head last year that it felt like a blowout, but didn't look like one on the scoreboard. Maybe that unfolds. I will say this: if my scenario unfolds and it's as bad as I think it could be, we're gonna have a third full week of drama. This will be 3 weeks in a row. I don't know what the drama will be, but I think if your scenario unfolds, there'll be a little bit of a glimmer of hope that they can rebound, maybe score one of those top 10 upset wins with Michigan or Michigan State, and get some wins the rest of the way. We'll see what happens. 7:30 p.m. in Columbus, the Big House, Saturday night, Penn State, Ohio State. That's Daniel Gallen. I'm Dustin Hockensmith. This has been our Friday recruiting / season episode of the Blue White Breakdown. You can follow Daniel on Twitter for all kinds of updates in game, out of game during the week at Daniel JT Gallen. You can find everything we do from Daniel, Bob, Dave, myself on PennLive.com/Penn State football. And for all editions of the Blue White Breakdown, check out Alexa, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Blue White Breakdown.